The thing that's radically different about the Trump approach is how willing he is to use trade, not just for issues to do with the American domestic electorate. So saying, actually, we need for political stability to reshore industrially to some extent anyway. It's the fact that he's willing to use trade as a geopolitical weapon across a whole set of issues. And you can see that obviously in relation to Canada, where it was tied quite explicitly to the earlier rhetoric about really how Canada shouldn't exist as far as he was concerned as an independent state. And you can see it now in at least the public justification that's being used for the extra 25% tariffs on India purchasing oil from Russia, a couple of million barrels a day. And Trump is also pretty clearly willing to play divide and rule, like the way that Britain was effectively offered a trade agreement before the European Union was. So do I think that there's any kind of strategic rationale or domestic politics rationale for that side of it? I'm not really convinced by it. Having said that, I think that it's not really realistic to think that there's going to be any American president for the foreseeable future who's going to say, look, que sera, if you like, in terms of China's approach to trade and manufacturing production. China's just far too an important economy and too seismic in its consequences now for any American president to take that approach. And again, it doesn't mean to say there won't be all kinds of downsides to the way this issue is then dealt with, but I just think it's politically unrealistic to think that it would go away under another president. What's interesting about what happened from April in terms of Trump's second attempt at a trade war with China is how quickly China was able to bring pressure upon the Trump administration over the rare earths just by putting an embargo on the sale of 7 of them, not just to the United States, but to others as well. And I read the sort of stop-start nature of what's happened since in terms of that trade war through China's ability to pressure on rare earths. So it's not that the United States doesn't have advantages if you were going to get into a wartime situation in terms of being able to impose really significant harm upon China through naval control of transit. But in the situation without war, then that's a different matter. And then the other thing I think that's happened that is really interesting, and this is just in the last couple of weeks, is the effect of the trade war has nonetheless been for China to pull away from buying liquefied natural gas from the US. That is quite a blow in itself to China's approach to importing gas, which has been to have as much diverse supply as possible. It's pretty much the same approach to diversity that Winston Churchill took to when he was turning the British Navy away from coal to oil, saying we need diversity of supply. But now China seems committed to building this second pipeline, which looked like it was dead and buried. But in the context of the trade war, has come back again, because in a world in which the Western Hemisphere is becoming more important in energy terms, does China actually want dependency upon the Western Hemisphere, particularly in a context in which the United States is willing to use trade in energy as a pretty clear geopolitical weapon? I don't think it can be really underestimated what a significant change it was for the United States to become A, gas exporter, and B, for the United States to become the world's largest oil producer. I think that this is sometimes really quite underestimated in its consequences, because if you wind the clock back to the crash, essentially there were 2 large oil producers in the world, and they don't have cooperative relations with each other. That's Saudi Arabia, obviously, and Russia. And then you have a third country in the United States that rises to become, in the end, the world's largest oil producer. And that is incredibly disruptive of its relations, both with Russia and Saudi Arabia. And it pushes Russia and Saudi Arabia into a new cartel, OPEC Plus, from 2016. And I think it is important to see how the world economy and its recovery from the crash has depended on that staggering rise of US shale. And then I think the question of how long the shale boom lasts before we start seeing some significant declines in overall shale production is a very live question. So I think one way of thinking about the Biden administration's failure, if you like, was that it bet that there could be a significant shift through the energy transition to electrification by the time that the shale oil boom would be on the decline. And that was a failed bet. I think the second thing that's true is that if you look since the pandemic, where the growth more generally in oil production has come from, so not just out of shale, it's come out of the Western Hemisphere. Brazil's been quite important to that. Guyana has been even more important to that. Canada has moved as well with the new pipeline selling to China. So the Western Hemisphere has become more important in fossil fuel energy, particularly oil, but not only oil because of the United States LNG, since the 30s. That is again quite changing, and I think that is part of the explanation as to why the politics of the Western Hemisphere has become very much part of the present moment. It's not at all clear that the world can do without Russia as an energy player in the medium term. I'm not sure that it's viable to say, okay, Russian energy goes to China, to India, other parts of Asia, and to Turkey. And this goes back to the question of what is going to happen at the end of this decade, beginning of the next decade, if there isn't a significant reduction in oil consumption. And if you look at what the International Energy Agency has been saying, literally just this week, is now forecasting that oil consumption is going to rise till at least 2050. So it's really pushed back on the idea that peak oil consumption is arising anytime soon. Its new message is, look, if there's not investment just in existing capacity, there's going to be serious difficulty by the end of the decade. Now, I think that in lots of ways with oil, a way is always found. But one of the ways in which this time a way will be found, I think, will be accommodation with Russia again by the end of the decade. And you can see that one of the frustrations of Trump in not being able to force Putin to the table over Ukraine or being able to deliver is that the US oil companies, not least probably ExxonMobil, want to go back into Russia. And in that sense, I think it shouldn't be underestimated what a failure, not just in terms of his personal credibility, but in terms of any attempt at a long, a medium term at least, approach to energy, the inability of Trump to bring Russia's war against Ukraine to an end.